Hello, everyone. On behalf of Paraclete Press, welcome to the launch of a School of Embodied Poetics by Scott Cairns. Welcome, Scott and John.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you all for being here. It's a pleasure. My name is John Sweeney, and I'm the publisher at Paraclete Press. It's my joy to introduce Scott, who I think many of you probably know. Scott Cairns, the poet, is a librettist, an essayist, a translator, an author of 9 poetry collections, a professor of English and director of the low residency MFA program at Seattle Pacific University. His recent books include Anaphora New Poems, Slow Pilgrim, The Collected Poems, Idiot Psalms, Endless Life, which is translations and adaptations of Christian mystics, and a book-length essay titled The End of Suffering. His spiritual memoir, Short Trip to the Edge, has been translated into Greek and Romanian. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2006 and the Denise Levertov Award in 2014. He's been a longtime friend of many of ours and of everyone at Paraclete Press and Paraclete Poetry, and we're delighted that he's able to do this webinar with you today to launch his new chapbook. And now I turn it over to him to introduce it to you.
All right. Well, thank you, John, and thank you, Rachel. Yeah, it's a chapbook. I just want to say that it's probably a little more polemic of an undertaking than I'm used to, or maybe than you're used to my doing. But those of you who know me and with whom we've spoken about poetry already know that I have a sort of a cranky notion about the poetic operations of language, and I suppose those notions become sort of overtly presented here, albeit I trust in things that are still working as poems and not just documents of ideas, which is not a poem. But the first one in this is a group of 12 poems. I think this first poem was the one that got me thinking about doing a little bit of a more direct approach. It's called Fabric, Ekphrastic regarding Vesalius. And I don't know, most of you probably know Vesalius is De Humani Corporis Fabrica. It's the 16th century illustrations about the human anatomy that this particular Flemish guy, Andreas Vesalius, put together. But how he put it together was, I guess, always seemed very troubling to me, because what he did was he basically cut people up, corpses up. The result was, some knowledge. Like, you've seen these, yes, and then I think this is the one that disturbed me most. And then it was the self-portrait that really got this poem off the ground. So I'll now, after you've had some illustrations of what prompted this undertaking, I'm going to read to you Fabric, Ekphrastic regarding Vesalius. There's an epigraph here from one of my favorite poets, which is a joke because it's actually from one of my early poems called Embalming. And it's whatever this was to them, it is all yours now. What matters most is most infused within the patent matter of the host. What matters most is often lost whenever one sees fit to parse the one into a splay of bright constituents. Observe just here the keen degree to which a honed indifference attains its edge and pares away what may have kept us innocent and sick. The trick lies yet in severing one's sense of he from him whose glib humanity proved impediment to excavation heretofore. We must admire what special art obtains for us so clear such obvious advantage, the price of which, by all appearances, was one man's soul. And then the book proceeds with Erotikos Logos again. This is a title taken from Odysseus Elitis, and I've used it before in a prior poem, but this is, which is why it says again. And the epigraph in this one is from Pindar. There is a most vain class among men, those despising ordinary things, fixing their eyes upon distances, pursuing empty air with faint hopes. As a boy, I met a good many of these, praying in church. In most churches, even now, one can witness the ethereal sneaking in to rob the body of its substance. An unfortunate taste for transcendence manages yet to erode the mountain of its immanence, allowing for a thin and unsatisfying dream of unencumbered spirit to hold an airy hegemony. Such severe and severing demands of the sacred render it bodiless, biding ever elsewhere, if at all. Such persons prefer dream to flesh, prefer that even their Holy One remain both untouchable and unlikely to touch. Goodwill, good fortune. Once you quit the gravel road, stepping first onto the game trail, parsing the Salal, you have agreed already to meet what is so rarely approached, if all the while in some deep sense familiar. The damp earth beneath your boots is oddly welcoming. The damp leaves against your thighs, wet kiss. And the keen sense of earth, of animal and conifer join your breath, softening your sensible departure from the road. If you're lucky, you may see how much the woodpecker clinging to the hemlock trunk proves so very like the hemlock trunk. If you're lucky, you'll see how even the hemlock, as well as the cedar, fir, alder, the sword fern, bracken, and discreet huckleberry all bear such numinous life as the adamant woodpecker now clinging to each subtle undulation of the hemlock trunk. Yes, all of this with luck. I'm going to chase down to the back of the book where things get a little more direct. So this poem is actually called Minor Treatise, the Poetic. And I don't know if you want me to say much more about my distinction, but just in a nutshell, most of us are aware of how words are considered names for things, so that very often, you know, this is a fairly Neoplatonic notion that words are just names for things, that what really matters is the thing that the word names. A more rabbinic Hebraic notion of words is that they are also things and have agency, generative agency. And so in my thinking, a poem must partake of that activity to be a poem. If it merely names, refers back to documents, a past thing, a past event, past experience, a past thought. It might be a useful document, but it's not quite a poem, because a poem as such must bear that energy that, induces the reader to make with it, to make meaning with it. The meaning of a poem is not a retrospective, it's not solely in the past. It must always be just about to be made, which is what the reader does with the poem when the reader reads it and makes with it, makes meaning with it. So this is a minor treatise, the Poetic, proves to be an operation of language where in the presence and activity of inexhaustible, indeterminate enormity is even so apprehended in a discrete space. Think theanthropos, think logos to theou. That's a little heady, yes, that's a little much. Still, I need you to up the ante on what it is you expect the poem to do. If it refers merely, if it points away from itself overmuch to one or another profound event or thought preceding the moment of the poem, the imposture fails to be a poem. It fails to make, fails to occasion anything approaching generative agency on the page, and you have got yourself a heartbreak on the way. Failing in this, it will further fail to enhance the previous, which after all is precisely what the poem must do. It must make a new thing, even while employing some prior thing, generously given. Two more poems that end the book. One, this is called Butter. Unguent of the morning toast and brightly effervescent bath of the feathery morning egg. Just so. The sweet vutero of Greece makes all things more acute, if more suggestive of the bawling goat, its scent. In Italy, the burro breaks one's heart with mild, mute solicitude, there mingling the umbracelli with the fragrant pea. Trekking once through the furnace of the vast green Hakiriki, I chanced upon 3 goat herds at their midday meal and fell readily into my chosen role as famished Xeno, foolish Xeno, unprepared. Their coarse rusks proved most elegant palates for the curds, the thrombas, the bit of fish. At their grill, mid the tsipuro and cool kasi, they toasted slabs of wheat bread, which we smeared with vutero and thyme. Much later, as I packed to leave the beloved city, the beloved Stelios gave to me a jar of butter. Think of it, a jar of butter. And then the title poem finishes the chapbook. It's called A School of Embodied Poetics. One of my beloved godsons, wonderful poet, Jeffrey Pethybridge, runs a famous Ginsbergian founded School of Disembodied Poetics in Boulder, Colorado. So Jeffrey works there. That fact is something about which I tease him plenty. But so because of, in part to make up for my teasing him over the years about that unfortunate name for a really lovely organization, I decided to dedicate this poem to him. So it's A School of Embodied Poetics for Jeffrey Pethybridge. Sure enough, bodies fail, but their failure proves relatively brief. Their failure proves not to be forever. What proves to be everlasting is the final wedding of spirit and flesh. Meantime, what parting most of us will suffer turns out to be but trial separation, not to be mistaken for anything like a sad conclusion. Biting into what turned out to be a very ripe peach, the juices glistening my whiskered chin, I chanced upon this passing thought. All poetics, per se, must have to do with making, must have to do with stuff, the glistening matter at hand, say, as well as the bodily response to whatever it is the shaper shapes. My wife happened into the room just as I was imagining another airy stanza. Enough, I thought, enough. So that's that. There are 12 such poems in the book. But what do we do now, oh my people?
Well, we do have some questions, Scott, if you'd like to field some of those now.
Well, prove it. Prove it that you have some questions.
Jody Collins is asking, she says, Scott, I've always been intrigued and curious about your command of Greek and love of all things Greece. How did that come to be so, sir?
Well, Jody, you don't need to call me sir. I know who that person is. I don't have a command of Greek. I do have a fascination with Greek, an ongoing labor at acquiring better Greek. But the fascination, I think, it began before I became Orthodox, but it certainly assisted my becoming a Greek Orthodox Christian. So, but it began with my becoming a poet and noticing that being an English poet has one of many advantages. One of which is that English itself is, relatively speaking, just a museum of other languages. It would not be what it is were it not for Greek or Latin or Hebrew or some of the languages that all have gone into giving us our fairly diverse vocabulary. And the more you know any of those languages, a Latinic language or a Greek, you will notice in your own, if you didn't, you would use these English words as if they were just that. The more etymological canniness you have about the words hiding in the words haunting the words, the more you can see happening in that word on the page, and the more suggestive it becomes. So for a poet, some facility with Greek and Latin in particular is very useful to knowing how much you can suggest in an otherwise fairly simple seeming word. And so that began my fascination with Greek. And then as I became, as the years passed, I guess I've been Orthodox about 25 years. And during that time, I've attended liturgy and have heard, I'm fortunate in that most of my experience, though not when I'm in Greece, but when I'm in the States, I have had the fortune of attending services, parts of which are in English and parts of which are in Greek. And sometimes, for instance, in our parish in Columbia, Missouri, we would sometimes flip things around so that what we did in Greek this week would the following week be done in English. And so you can actually hear what I started to notice then was that the English versions became richer because I was obliged to notice the etymological reach of what seemed like a very simple psalm, translated as well as it could have been into English, but then when you have a little glimpse of the Greek version of that word, of that Hebrew word, you get it starts to open more, and more can be made with, well, even in prayer. you find yourself saying what you didn't mean to say or didn't know to say, but the words themselves, the language of the Psalms themselves, lead you into saying what you probably should be attending to. Thanks, Jody.
And in a sort of a related question, I would say, William is asking, would you share about your journey to orthodoxy and its impact on your poetry?
Yeah. As you may have heard some of this in the last utterance, but I think my poetry led me to orthodoxy. I was raised a fairly, run-of-the-mill, fundamental type Protestant Christian in the US. And so my sense of the scriptures was maybe a little thin. As I became a poet, which preceded my becoming Orthodox, I started paying more attention to the language, and then I actually stumbled upon that interesting distinction between Hebraic notions of words and Hellenic notions of words fairly early on, and there was a point at which I actually thought, well, maybe there was a brief period where actually, while I was studying Hebrew, I was also studying Judaism, and considered, because that understanding of language seemed to me to be so much profoundly truer, more true than my prior understanding of language, that I thought, well, maybe I needed to be Jewish to own that. Turns out, Eastern Christendom is rife with that understanding. The saint whose name I took when I became Orthodox, Saint Isaac of Syria, himself a writer of Aramaic, Syriac rather, and that Syriac being a Semitic language, the Syriac writer, the Aramaic writer, these writers in that region were cognizant of expansive reach of language, that generative operation of language. So I found that I could have my Christ and eat him too by staying put in the Christian faith, but moving to the East, where that language, that canniness, that awareness, that honoring of the expansive reach of the words was more commonplace and more appreciated. That's all I've got to say about that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is, I'm trying to organize these questions here as they're coming in quite quickly. Donnie Cole references some lines from Mary Oliver, and you've certainly touched on this, Scott. He says, one of my favorite lines from Mary Oliver, though not a poem, reads, "Writing is neither vibrant life nor docile artifact, but a text that would put all its money on the hope of suggestion." How does this compare to the Hebraic view of words you mentioned?
It seems informed by that Hebraic view, actually. And most of the poets that most of you love are doing this thing, and the fact that they're doing it comes out of an understanding that transcends notions of transcendence and privileges notions of immanence, so that the words themselves obtain a kind of density and inconclusiveness that most poets understand, and this is actually the hardest lesson for young poets, because they most of them, not all, but most people come to poetry as read as writing it, and maybe even people who read it thinking that it's a document of a thing, and if you're writing it and you're a young person, you offer these, they're lovely things very often, but they are primarily understood to be representing something that happened, something that's done, and and that's sometimes the hardest lesson for a young poet to learn, is that that's not enough, you know. That's a good start, because you do want to make a text that someone can attend, but you have to learn how to appreciate the words, then shape the words on the page so that they have an opportunity to do more than you anticipated or than you meant to document. That you find yourself saying what you need to say, but you didn't know to say. The words lead you into that saying. And so Mary Oliver knew that beautifully, yeah.
There are lots of questions here, Scott, about the new digital age, the Zoom age. Alex Joyner says, your poetry is so embodied, incarnational. How do you sense our relation to embodiment is changing in this new Zoom age?
Yeah, I think it's yet to be seen. I pray that we get together again one of these days. But you know, I direct a low residency MFA program for Seattle Pacific University, and for the first time in our 15 years of existence, we were obliged to cancel. Well, we didn't actually cancel the residency, we just moved it online. People typically would fly here to Seattle and then go to Whidbey Island, and we'd spend 10 days in close quarters. And that was right at the height of, it was in mid-March, so it was right at the height of all the changes. So we had to, in short order, move. I think it was a satisfying and surprisingly successful move, but it wasn't the same. And I pray that we can return to the face-to-face again. Though this is far better than, you know, not communicating, which is what most of us would be stuck with if we didn't have this capacity. So yeah, I'm no prophet. I don't even play one on TV. I just I'm just trying to figure out what this is going to do to us myself. I pray that it doesn't. I pray that it doesn't do lasting damage to our sense of ourselves as bodies, and not just images. I mean, we are images, but there's a word you want to unpack for a long time. So.
Scott, Stephen Wright is asking, do you have any thoughts on how reading poetry, either individually or as groups or families, might minister to the spirit in the midst of our current health crisis? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, they always make me feel better. And you know, I don't know about you guys, but on those occasions when I have been laid up, whether from infirmity or just isolation for being alone, you know, opening a book of poems in particular has always fed me. I think it keeps us aware that there's a lot here, and there's a lot more in here than we apprehend. And then the poem, I think, presence of poetry, sharing a poem in particular with a group of people, helps us to appreciate, I think, more readily. Was it? Hope I don't get this wrong, because I imagine this is being recorded, and then if I get this reference wrong, people will ridicule me for my failure. But was it Mallarmé that said there is another world, and it's in this one? Was that Mallarmé? Was that someone else? Someone who's chatting, please correct me. We do want to get the name right, but whoever it was, I don't think it was Mallarmé, but that was the first name that came to mind. So it must have been someone French. Anyway, there is another world, and it's in this one. That's what a poem helps you see. You know, I guess our reality is thicker and good nougaty, a good textured poem loaded with nougaty goodness is more likely to help you appreciate that, I think.
Michael is asking, what is your prayer rule? How has it shaped your poetics lately?
Well, my prayer rule has changed lately due to the circumstances. So I usually just say the Trisagion prayers and then some evening prayers for the living and the dead, and call it a night. And what I do now after the Trisagion prayers is a friend from church posted a text of an akathist for the Pantanasa. So there's an icon. I'm going to fetch it. Don't go away. So this is an icon. It's a replica of an icon that's at a monastery, Vatopedi Monastery on Mount Athos. And so that's where I first met the icon. But then there's an akathist. Akathist means it's not you don't sit for it, you stand. It's a prayer where you stand and say the prayers. But the akathist for the Pantanasa, the queen of all, is this particular icon, and copies of it have been associated with a lot of miraculous healing. Particularly, the story goes that a lot of the children of the Chernobyl accident, the whole population was really riddled with cancers. And so they took the original of this icon to Russia, to Ukraine, and people venerated it, and many, many healings occurred. So thereafter, the Pandanasa icon has been considered a miracle working icon for healing. And so it occurred to this woman at my church who was praying for her daughter who was undergoing some surgeries. It occurred to her to use to pray the akathist. And so since deciding to do that, that's what has been my rule of prayer. Every evening is praying for the healing of all, through the queen of all. So there you go.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm just scrolling through. Brian Volk says, he's a friend. Here he is. He says, hey, brother man. The delightful Martha Serpas said she was waiting for you to finish a promised essay on embodied poetics. I think you've done it here in poems, but then you've been doing that all along. Is a prose version now superfluous?
Well, it probably always was. But the Brian, and thank you to Martha when you see her. I may yet chip away at it, but Father Robert Barth wrote a beautiful book about Coleridge's Poetics. And when I was reading that book, it occurred to me that my book was unnecessary, because pretty much all of the way Father Robert Barth wrote about Coleridge's Poetics pretty much encapsulated what little I glimpsed to say about this. And so I may still chip away at it. I have a draft, a big old baggy draft of this thing on my computer. So I may get to it, but I don't think anyone needs it. If it has any use, it would be for me to articulate and maybe more intentionally mess with those ideas a little more more in depth than I had previously. But thanks, Brian, for rubbing it in.
A few helpful souls have noted that quotation you made earlier came from Paul Éluard.
Éluard, there you go. See, I knew it. So, but French.
You were right.
That's not close enough. So forgive me. And is there any way to edit this? And
I'm sure we'll find a way. Scott, Howard Schefferman is noting, he said, perhaps this demonstrates that I'm disembodied, but what is a chapbook and what drew you to that format? So lots of poetry education here today.
John Sweeney, what drew me to that format?
Am I on mute or can you hear me?
I can
We
hear
can
you.
hear you.
Well, I think what drew you to that format was that that's about how many poems we had since your last volume, and they all fit together in a cohesive piece, right? I mean, you know, you didn't have,
That's a gentle way of saying I was under duress to come up with a chapbook because that's what John wanted to make.
well, part of it, it's an experiment a little bit for us at Paraclete, and Scott was willing to join us in the experiment. The experiment being, let's create a thin volume in between volumes of poems, of new poems, and let's do it in a special way. So I don't think we've mentioned this yet, but this one is done in sort of a special way. In fact, okay, you're looking at it right now. This is part of it, is that every copy is hand sewn, and it's a limited edition. We printed 300 and only 300. We won't be printing more, even if everybody runs out and buys one and we run out. We won't be reprinting. And everyone was hand sewn, and everyone was signed by the poet. So we wanted to do something that participates a little bit in book craft, in addition to poetry craft.
Another body thing, a
Yes.
thing. Yeah. So good. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. But I had these poems. I've been working on these poems. Some of them are kind of recent. Some of them I've had around for a while, but they really had to do with, they were a little more polemic than I'm used to doing. So I actually thought this would be an opportunity to employ them with some other poems that maybe I trust performed what these things were arguing.
Thanks, Scott. Jody mentions the first poem mentioning the host that you read seems fitting for this day, Passover, Pesach. Just so you know, she says, everything I know about poetry is distilled in your essay, The First Lesson in Syllable of Water, exploding my understanding of what a poem truly is.
Well, that's not a question, right?
I suppose it's more of a comment.
Thank you, Jody. And good Pesach to you.
Jen Hartenberg is asking, do you have favorite Greek poets that you like to read? What are some good English translations of Greek poetry that you might recommend?
Well, I have a good number of Greek poets, modern Greek poets that I admire and actually love. Chief among those is Constantine Kavafi, translated by many people. I think the initial one I had was by Ray Dalvin, and I guess when some of those poems, when I think of them in that translation. And then, but there's and then my good friend, my beloved friend, Aliki Barnstone has done a translation as well, which also opens the poems, in some of the poems differently, and opens the reader to different understandings of those poems. The one that I use most often now is Daniel Mendelssohn. Yeah, Mendelssohn. Boy, I hope I have that right. In that case, it's one of the more recent Kavafi translations, but it's also I think the long essay that introduces the volume is worth the price of admission. It's really stunning, smart, eye-opening essay about Kavafi, his biography and his his poetry. So Cavafy is chief among them, but Seferis, Elitis, those are poets I read a good bit. Then there are some really lovely live ones who I sometimes get to see in Greece, but Titos Patrikios is a lovely poet. Adrian Kalfopoulou. I always mispronounce her, Kalfopoulou. But
people are asking for the spellings of some of those poets, but maybe we can compile a list to send out to everyone if that would make life a little easier.
Yeah.
Michael is asking, how are the monks at Mount Athos doing?
Well, they have had some illness there with COVID, but the monks can take a lot of stuff, and they pray for us all the time, so it might be we might return the favor praying for them now. They have very accomplished medical people who are monks on the Holy Mountain, so they're in good care. I can't imagine a better place to be ill if I were to fall deathly ill, to be surrounded by such loving men. But I do know that they pray. They have vigils. They've had ever since the COVID outbreak across the earth began. They've been holding prayer vigils. All the monasteries and skeets, on the Holy Mountain hold prayer vigils, I think daily, for the healing of the world.
Naomi Dehaan says, what was the title of the book by Robert Barth that you mentioned earlier?
Well, I would have to go find it.
I actually quickly looked it up, and it's really expensive.
Oh.
Which made me think maybe Scott does need to write his book.
Just because make a cheaper edition of the ideas.
More accessible. I don't know. It was $100 or something.
Oh, but so it's out of print, I guess.
No, I think it looked like it was a monograph. A scholarly monograph.
Well, that's how it began. Was it Fordham or one of those presses?
Something like that. Yeah, I looked very quickly because I was supposed to be with you here, but
Did you happen to notice the title?
I'm sorry, I didn't. But it was easy to find, though.
Okay, we'll find it. Let people know, along with that list of the Greek poets.
Yeah, but Father Robert Barth, now fallen asleep maybe 10 years or so, but he's written a good number of books about the Romantic poets, and specifically Wordsworth and Coleridge. This book that I think focuses mostly on Coleridge is the one that, and it might have Coleridge's Poetics in the title.
Yeah, Coleridge, Romantic Imagination, Poetics, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the Romantic Imagination, Poetics, or something. Anyway, you Google it, you'll find something close enough, and then remind me.
Will do.
The book's down in my office. I'll fetch it later. Naomi, I know Naomi, so I'll email you, Naomi,
and I see in the comments that Jody Collins is recommending Malcolm Geit's book on the Mariner, which is wonderful also.
Yeah, no, that's very worthy. That's a delicious. This is a great time to read big, baggy, dense, thought-provoking books right now. So yeah, best time ever to read Malcolm's book. Hey, as long as you got some time on your hands, read some Geoffrey Hill poems. They really take a lot of time and a lot of attention. And what have you got but time and attention to spare right now? So
someone's also mentioning Shaped by the Word by the late Professor Robert Mulholland. Are you familiar?
I'm not. Okay.
Another one to check out, maybe.
Yeah.
Scott, Bob Dent says to describe these poems as being more polemical implies an opposing position. How would you define that position?
Well, they're arguing. They're doing yeah. Bob, I know Bob too, so I probably know everybody who's watching this. that's what friends are for. But Bob, I'm guessing to call a book that's arguing that poems do more than just name things, name arguments, say, is a little bit of a paradox if I then describe that book as polemical. But I do have this sort of curmudgeonly attitude about an opinion about what poems are and what they do. And whereas in the past I've been satisfied with just trying to do that and trust that people get the difference between what I'm doing and what poems that don't do that are not doing. Then when I say this is more polemical, it's a little more direct in making that case. Albeit I trust assisted by other things that are actually poetic and not just documents of an opinion. So thanks also for rubbing it in, Bob.
Brian Volk's wife was just wondering if you were in her kitchen and why wasn't she invited? So lots of people happy to see you.
I do. You know, another thing we had to cancel was our group Mystikos was going to go to Greece for almost the whole month of June, go to Athens and then go to the island of Seraphos and work with Carla Forche and Ilya Kaminsky and Brian Volk and Jill Hubert and a whole raft of wonderful people. Naomi Dahan. We had to postpone that until June 2021. But yeah, that was a heartbreak. There's a lot of heartbreak. I guess that to give up on a beautiful trip is the least of our worries at this point. But I was very sad that we weren't able to go do that thing, dig into the Greek and the Greek food.
Of course. I think that brings us to the end of our questions, Scott. I don't know if you wanted to read some more.
I might read one more. Let me find one that is less polemic. Oh wait, no, that's more polemic. Oh yeah. How about a little imagistic poem to finish with? It's called Snoqualmie Still Life. Our early snows have closed the mountain pass in a pristine ermine blanket, and our winds, unhurried, ripple ever so lightly the ermine fur. Our empty road glistens, lined by green conifers gone white with a late, thick drape of new snow. Our sky shines blue, utterly still, save for the intermittent twitch of its golden tail. The golden puma for the moment sits upright, centering our empty road. Good Passover, good Pascha to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you, John. Thank you to everyone who joined us.
Yes, thanks very much.